Wow. Wow, we have Paul Simon Bryant, my friend.
Hello.
My friend. We are unlikely friends. I met Paul, I think it was 2 years ago. I think it was about 2 years ago that we met. 2021, yeah, I think we met.
April.
And
it'll be 2 years in April.
Yeah, oh my God, 2 years in. And Paul is a shamanic healer and he's a shamanic teacher. I actually didn't know, I knew little bit, very little about shamanism before I met Paul. And I've learned a lot from him, and I love learning from him. I love learning anyway, but shamanism, in some ways, I kind of thought it was completely different from my spiritual roots, which are Islamic. But I actually found there is so much in common. And Paul today is going to be talking about how to reweave your life story, which is for me a fascinating subject in itself. Paul, I know, has I don't know what's happened here. Am I in a different meeting? Sorry, my laptop is kind of, apologies. Paul has a shop. It was in Plymouth, wasn't it? Am I right? Your shop?
Yeah. And I closed it a couple of days ago.
That's so right.
Online, yeah.
And so you are basically going to be, I think you're thinking about opening up another shop elsewhere. Am I right?
Yeah. So I had I say a shop. It was a market stall. It was a shop. It had shutters and it had a door and everything, but it was inside a market. But I'm actually in the process of moving into my own premises. So I have like everything under one roof, and within that as well, I'm building a community cafe and a spiritual library as well within that.
Wow.
To create more of a kind of a community around my shop and my business, in order to get people from not just different kind of spiritual pathways, but people within my own pagan community, getting people together to share ideas, to build a foundation, and just a place for people to kind of meet up and to learn and kind of hear more about what I do. Because a lot of what I do within my shop, I talk a lot about mythology. In particular, I talk about Celtic mythology, because that's very much my path. And I weave so much of that mythology into the stories. And I get people that come past and they'll look at sort of some of my things in my shop. So I have like these Celtic deity statues, like, for example, Bridget or Canonus. And people go, oh, that's really interesting. And then I'll tell them some mythology behind it. And whilst they might not always buy, they're so enthused by understanding and listening to these stories. And in a way, and the beauty of mythology, which is kind of what I'm going to go and talking about, the beauty of mythology is that it's not abstract. It's not something necessarily ancient, whilst yes, it is. But in a way, we can use mythology and it still becomes relevant today, because the trials and the challenges of our ancestors, whilst they might be slightly different, they very much relate to our trials today. You know, for example, we might not be facing predators every day, but we certainly face difficult, challenging people. We live in a time where there's lots of uncertainty and the cost of living is going up. So the sort of the survival kind of mode is being kicked in for lots of people, and that's very relevant to our ancestors. Whilst the way in which they had to survive is different, we can all appreciate being stuck in survival mode. As business people, like, getting out of our survival mode is really important in order for us to, and I'd like to be able to make a word that rhymes with this, but to move from survival mode into like thriving mode. The best I come up with once, I said thrival mode, and I was like, that just sounds silly, but it's the power of words, right? Words are really powerful. So yeah.
And I think what I really love is, I mean, I'm not sure whether we made history, probably haven't made history, but like, you with your paganistic roots and mine with my Islamic monotheistic roots, sometimes that looks like a whole antithesis, like we should be like enemies, but
Yeah.
we are such good friends, such unlikely friends, but such good friends. And
Yes.
that's what I kind of really love about you, Paul, in the way that you teach shamanism and you teach what you're about to teach us all. And whoever is watching the recording, I want you to really, wherever you come from, whether you are of a faith or of no faith, whether you are open to this, I want you to, whether you feel that you're going to be close to this, I want you to just open your heart and open your mind and open your soul. Because I think when you do that, it actually means that you actually expand and you learn more. When we are so closed, and a lot of us, even the ones that think are open-minded, we all have very narrow visions, and we all sometimes subscribe. What I find really interesting, a couple of days ago, I was listening to somebody that had delivered a TED talk, a Nigerian writer, who was talking about don't subscribe to the single story, you know, and the fact that you're talking about reweaving your story. Sometimes we have the single story of our own life. And I've got so many questions, and I'm now going to just say a little bit more about Paul, and then I'm going to hand it over to you to deliver what you're going to deliver. And I probably will ask some questions later on. I also know, Paul, in some ways you are similar to me because you have a background in social care.
Yeah.
And it was it about 7 years ago that you started your business? Am I right?
4 years ago.
4 years
4
ago,
years ago.
sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know it was initially it was an online business which you still run,
Yeah.
and also now it's also a product-based business. Am I right?
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's been an interesting journey, but the reason why you said 7, why that stuck in your mind, is that this is actually my 7th attempt at setting up a business, and my most successful. You know, most of the other ones like canned within the first few months. This one, you know, I've stuck it out. I say I've stuck it out. It's succeeded because I think, and this is the interesting thing about story, right? So what I tried to do before in all my other sort of iterations of my business was to create something that I thought would be have mass appeal. And in doing so, what I did was I lost the authentic bit. I lost the bit that was me. And a lot of that comes from fear. And that's a story that I was telling myself, that no one would show up if I did something that was authentically me. But then that's actually quite the opposite. And being the more authentically me, even those people who aren't interested in paganism or they aren't interested in shamanism, they actually come because I can speak with such a level of passion and knowledge and wisdom that people just get hooked in it. And they're like, wow, okay, I never knew that would be a thing. Like you said, like with the most unlikeliest of friends, you come from a very monotheistic, I come from a very polytheistic, but yet there's a shared kind of wisdom, you know. I mean, you share a lot of stuff about Rumi. I love Rumi, you know, and I even though whilst I'm not Muslim, I've read parts of the Qur'an. One of my favorite quotes, he who hurts a man hurts the whole of humanity. He who helps a man helps the whole of humanity. And one of my other favorite ones was all that is good comes from God, all that is evil comes from man. And it's interesting, like whilst not a Muslim, those two things have had such a powerful impact on my own story that if I was to be closed-minded, then I wouldn't have received that richness, that enrichment from learning about other cultures. And that's part of my story, is that in my search for my own faith, I've studied lots. I've studied the Kabbalah. I've studied Jewish mysticism. I've studied things like curanderismo from Mexico. I've studied northern shamanism. I've studied folk traditions from around the world. Gnosticism, like in my youth, and still to this day, I love learning, you know, and that thirst for like knowledge and wisdom, because wisdom is really what we all want. it's just insatiable. So again, I agree, like that, opening your mind to, and your soul and your heart to different ideas, because it's in when we do that, actually we go, oh, actually that's really relatable. Oh, actually I can get that. I wouldn't have thought of it that way. And again, that's that, by being that more authentic person, that's how I created such a successful business. It's my lifeblood. So yeah. So today I want to talk to you about the power of story, and how that affects our lives, and how we can unweave the old limiting story that we have and reweave it into something more powerful. So to do that, we have to understand story. So story is as ancient as the word. You know, if we go right the way back to the very beginning, at some point, people used story, parable, you know, mythology, allegory, and as a way to translate and transmit different ideas, wisdom, stories, whether it's Greek, whether it's Roman, whether it's, you know, Middle Eastern, you know, or Celtic, all the way around the world. Every culture has its mythology, and it's the story and the history of those people, of our ancestors. So for me, like, I draw heavily from the Celtic stories, so from around the Celtic lands, so from Scotland, from Wales, from Ireland, from Cornwall. England doesn't really have much of it kind of has a bit of a Celtic history, but it's not as entrenched as some of the kind of northerly parts of the UK. And when we look at story, Joseph Campbell, kind of through his Hero of a Thousand Faces, like he listed a set of stages that every story goes through. When you look at movies is a modern form of mythology. You know, like for me, I'm a massive sci-fi and fantasy geek. So growing up, like watching movies like Star Wars, or watching things like Lord of the Rings, you know, or even superhero stuff, there's always this person who starts off as an ordinary person, a farm boy, or, you know, just an everyday average Joe who somehow gets called to go on some amazing story of transformation. You know, Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, you know, he's just a farm boy, but really he plays a greater role within destiny, you know, within the destiny of his own people. And through, you know, an accidental meeting with two droids, starts off on this incredible story, this incredible adventure, and that's the call. And then from that, he meets a guide, which is obviously Obi-Wan Kenobi. And then he goes through a series of trials and tribulations as he becomes the person he's meant to be, which is the hero of the Rebel Alliance. And he goes through his own kind of metaphorical death and rebirth. So it's the letting go of who he was, the innocent farm boy from some desolate, you know, desert planet, to become the hero. And he goes through that transformation. And of course, through doing that, he becomes one with himself and with his own greater story, the process of atonement, which when you look at the word atonement, it's two words, it's at one-ment. It's becoming at one with oneself. And of course, as a result of that, he returns with the gift. Like, so the gift in that is that he learns how to use the Force, so he becomes a Jedi. How does that relate to us as people? Well, all of us at some point get to a point in our lives where we recognize that perhaps things don't work the way that we want them to. We're not living the life that we want, or we go through a set of circumstances. Perhaps it's losing a job, or the end of a relationship, or, you know, the death of a loved one, that causes us to look at ourselves and look at our life and go, well, perhaps there's more to it than this. Perhaps there's more to life. I can be more than this. And then we set out on some journey. That journey is a journey of the self, the one of growth, to you know, be more than we were before. And then through that, we might meet a guide, and whether that guide is you know, a wise old man, or a Gandalf, or a hermit in a cave, or a character like Obi-Wan Kenobi, or whether it's a book or a program, it's that meeting that becomes the catalyst for the greater journey. And of course, like St. John of the Cross talked about, you know, and this is why that greater kind of learning that I can draw from all these different sources. So St. John of the Cross said, he talked about the dark night of the soul, and that's the trials and tribulations, and especially for those of us who have stepped onto a more spiritual path. Like my coming onto a spiritual path was a result of drug addiction. That was my sort of wake up my call to action was that actually, you know, I woke up one morning after a bender and kind of went, oh my God, I need to change the way I live my life because I can't do this anymore. And in doing that, I went on this journey, this search, and my guide were the many books and the videos and the websites and all these things. And eventually, of course, physical teachers, you know, came in, and then teachers from beyond, like beyond the beyond the, what I would call beyond the veil, which is the spiritual teachers, my ancestors, my guides, power animals. And then I went through these series of trials and tribulations that we call the dark night of the soul. It's that point between who we were and who we're becoming, and the healing that I had to go to in particular, all the healing I had to go through, the years of sustained trauma, the stories that I would tell about myself, all these kind of narratives that were impacting my life that had set me on the journey to becoming a drug addict. And again, if we overlay that to our own life, perhaps it's the broken down relationship that becomes the catalyst, you know, or the loss of a job. I mean, like, oh my God, well, who am I now? And it's really interesting that much of who we are is a story that we tell about ourselves. So if you think about it this way, when people introduce themselves, they're like, hello, and I'm going to use an example. I'm going to create a guy called John, and John's a doctor, right? And every time John goes around, he goes to a party, he's like, hello, I'm John, I'm a doctor. And people go, oh, wow, really? What kind of doctor? He's like, I'm a neurosurgeon. That's so exciting. Yeah, he must have been working on brains. And it gets people talking to him, right? But what happens the day that John is no longer a doctor? If he retires, great. He can go, hi, I'm John, a retired doctor. I spent 40 years as a neurosurgeon. That must have been really rewarding, blah, 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 blah. And he can talk about, all the brains he operated on, the people that he saved. But what happens if John loses his job because someone dies on the operating table? Hello, I'm John. Oh no, his entire story is invested in the fact that he's a doctor. It's the same when we only ever term ourselves in terms of our gender or a job or a sexuality or a religion. What happens when that is no longer there? We enter into a crisis of identity, because much of who we are is woven into these labels, and these labels are a story, and each one of those stories is a thread in the tapestry of our life, right? So that becomes the core. And then the challenge, obviously, the trials and the tribulations, it's the becoming of something new, the learning, the growth, the real challenges that come from growing beyond who we were, from moving from our farm boy existence or farm woman existence into that greater hero of our own story. And of course, at some point, there comes a point at the midway point where who we were and who we're becoming ends. So the old personality dies within our own story. We've transformed, we're changing. So we let go, and it's almost like shedding a skin, shedding a set of clothes, or we become something new. And in doing so, the greater journey of transformation rapidly starts to happen. We start to challenge all of the worldviews that we have, perhaps. Or, for example, if it was a relationship that ended, all of these ideas about what it means to be a good wife or a good husband or a good partner are completely challenged. So now you have to look at it in a whole new way and go, well, actually, is that really true? And where did that come from? And from that, we enter into the greater concept of who we are becoming, this new person. We become at one with ourselves, or we become more peaceful. And I remember recently someone asked a question about healing. It was online, and it was something about, is there a point when you become okay with your healing? And my answer to that is that healing is never a destination, it's a journey. And we might get to a point where we reach a certain level of peacefulness with who we are. But just remember that at some point again in the future, the call to the journey is going to happen again. We're going to go through another crisis, or something's going to happen. We're going to have to go to that deeper level for our own healing and our own kind of peacefulness in our journey. And at the very end of this, of all of these journeys that we undertake, the hero's journey is the gift. It's often known as the return, or the gift of the goddess, or the elixir. The young hero comes back from the journey with whatever it is, the magical cup, the grail, or some other kind of metaphor that becomes a power that they have. And for us, like within our own spiritual journey, it's the gift of wisdom. And obviously, what's wisdom? Well, wisdom is just knowledge that we've applied through action, and we've learned something. We've created something deeper within that, and that's the hero's journey. And every mythology has that kind of basic general setup. I mean, sometimes a little bit different, and it's all come a lot. When Joseph Campbell came up with the hero's journey, he did it around kind of Hercules and his 12 labors, so that the 12 trials that he went on in order to become the hero god that he is. Well, obviously, we're not becoming gods, but we are becoming the hero of our own story. And I want to share with you one of my favorite pieces of mythology from the Celtic story, and it really filters very nicely into the work that I do. So one of the things, or the majority of what I do with my clients, is I work with them on this idea, this Celtic idea known as Geis, and it's a curse or taboo that's handed down to us from someone else. And all of the Celtic hero stories center around the central character being placed under a curse, so they've got a taboo, or they've got a number of them. And for example, Cuchulainn, the Irish hero and king, had several of these. And how that relates to us today, well, I'm not suggesting that our parents, willfully curse us like in some of these ancient stories, but what they do is they place us under a story, a spell that becomes our life script. And we know this from families. Like, every family has its taboo. We don't do that in this family. We don't vote X pie, or we don't follow that religion because we're Christians, or we're this or we're that. No one in our family is going to become a nurse. We're all construction workers, or those are the family taboos, the family rules. And the way that the Geis as a curse works in our modern day life story, our life script, excuse me, is the idea that we're taught from a very young age what is necessary for us to receive love, praise, acceptance, positive regard. And we're taught that we're too much of this, or we're too little of that, or if we could just be like your sister, or whatever it is. This then gets encoded within us, and it affects the life choices that we make, all of the choices that we make, because in the back of our mind is this idea that we're less than perfect, that we're less than good enough, that if we could just be more intelligent, more smarter, more this, that, or the other, then we would be a better person, which then gets us sucked into things like people pleasing and self-sabotage, getting us stuck in survival mode. This is the life script, and this is the very work that I do with people. So I look at the life script that we have. Each one is a thread in a tapestry. That a tapestry, imagine like a beautiful tapestry on the wall, and it's your entire life story. Each thread within that is a choice, a decision that you have made, and it's woven into the greater story. And some of these weaves are knotted together. But the question is, and I'd ask you just to think about this for the sort of remainder as I talk, how many of those choices did you make were conscious, fully aware, fully within your body, within your spirit, within your mind? Did you knowingly take, knowing and understanding the consequences and the action and reaction of that choice? Would you say that it was 100% of all your choices? 90? 75? 50? I would hazard a guess that the majority of the choices that we make, until we become more conscious of our choices, we probably make very few conscious choices. And even now, like even with the work I do, sometimes I make choices and I think, what on earth did I do that for? And then I have to remind myself that, that's a life script that's running in the background. That's my Geis. And somehow I've been pulled into this automatic kind of choice thinking making. So we have to constantly be aware of our choices and our actions. So I want to share with you one of my favorite pieces of Celtic mythology. Actually, I can't really say it's one of my favorite because I love the whole thing. But this particular story, it really, really embodies this idea. So in the Welsh, in Wales, there was a king who was known as Math, and Math could only keep himself alive. And this is the oddity of some of these stories, right? But this is his Geis. He could only keep himself alive between battles by laying his feet in the lap of a virgin. And he had a brother known as Gwydion. And Gwydion was a great magician, equal, I suppose, to very much Merlin. In fact, so powerful a magician was Gwydion that he could turn the night into day, and he could turn the world upside down. He could bring things to life that were dead, and he could create life from nothing. And they had a niece that was known as Arianrhod, and she's the Welsh goddess of fate. And one day, Math went off to battle, and whilst he was away, unfortunately and quite tragically, his virgin was defiled by two of his servants. And on his return, he decided to marry her as an act of, to save her honor. But however, he needed a virgin because he was going to die. So Gwydion, being the great magician that he is, took his staff and he threw it upon the ground, and he made all the women of the court jump over this staff in order to determine who was to be the next virgin, and which King Math's feet would be left lying in. Anyway, Arianrhod jumps over it, and a baby fell out of her, and a blob. And Gwydion, noticing the blob, whisked the blob away and he put it into a magical casket known as a carcle, and he left it in his room. Anyway, so Arianrhod, obviously she can't be the virgin, but eventually they find a virgin for Math, and he's able to lay his feet, and he obviously doesn't die. However, the blob that's inside this magical casket begins to grow into a boy, and the boy grows at an exceptional rate. At the age of 4, he's the size of an 8-year-old. So eventually he grows to manhood at the age of 16. And Gwydion decides that he's going to take the boy to meet his mother, who's been completely oblivious. She thinks she's got one child, and turns out she's got 2. So he brings Lai, as the boy is known, before his mother, Arianrhod, and she's so angry at Gwydion's deception that she turns to the boy and she says, "You will never have a name." So he would never have a name like Lai the Magnificent or Lai the Powerful. So a name that's connected to his deeds. Anyway, Gwydion, feeling rather ashamed of himself, goes away, and he hatches a plan to get the boy a name. Right? He comes back a year later disguised as traveling bards, and they're out in the gardens, and the boy Lai picks up a stone and he throws it, and from hundreds of meters away, he hits a wren out of the sky, and it falls. And Arianrhod goes, "Oh my God, the lion has a hawk eye! Like, what an incredible throw!" Boom. She broke the gash accidentally, so she gave him a name. She called him the Young Lion. And Gwydion, feeling quite arrogant, says, "Ha ha! I fooled you! I've broken your curse." And Arianrhod is livid at him, at the deception, right? Because she really loves Gwydion. She loves Gwydion. Like, Gwydion and Math are like her entire life, but she's so angry. She says to the young boy, "You would never bear arms. You would never take a weapon." And Gwydion's thinking, "Oh God, right, I really messed up again here, haven't I?" So off they go away for a game for a year, and they come back. And this time they come disguised as traveling merchants. And Gwydion, being the powerful magician he is, he summons a phantom army to attack her castle. And in the affray, she starts handing out weapons. She hands the boy a sword, and obviously they defeat the enemy. And at the very end, Gwydion, once again, being arrogant, says, "Ha ha! I fooled you." And she's like, "Oh my God, I can't believe this guy's doing this." So she's livid once again. And she goes, "That's it. You would never marry a woman of the race of the earth." And of course, Gwydion's thinking, "Oh God, really buggered up here, haven't I?" And of course, he can't try this again because she's just going to see through the deception. So Gwydion and Math go out into the forest, and they gather up herbs of oak bloom, hawthorn, and meadowsweet, and they turn it into a woman known as Blood Awed. And she's the flower maiden. She's the flower goddess. Right? So they create a woman for Lai, and she falls hopelessly in love with Lai, and she doesn't understand why she's in love with him. Right? She's not in love with him, but Gwydion has made her, forced her to be in love with him. And for a year, she's completely besotted in him, and they live a really happy life. And then one day, she's out picking flowers, and she comes across this guy known as Gro Pabor, and she falls completely in love with him. But she's married to Lai, to the king of the forest, right, the young lion. So she can't pursue this relationship, but she does. And what she decides to do, that rather than leave Lai, because she feels like she can't, they hatch a plan over the year to murder him. So Blood Awood goes to Lai, and she says, I've had this terrible dream. You die, you're murdered, and I'm really upset, and I'm really worried about you. And Lai says, no, you don't need to worry. She said, he's like, my uncle Gwydion has he's cast a spell on me that I can never die unless in these strange circumstances. And she's like, oh, okay. And so what she does, she continues this story, and she keeps going back to him, this idea that, you know, she's had this terrible dream, and eventually she tricks him into telling her exactly the most bizarre, unlikely set of circumstances in which he can die. And it's simple, that he must be riding on the back of a boar north of a river at sunset by an arrow, by a spear side that's thrown from the east, right? That's gold tipped. Like the most unlikely set of circumstances that he could ever die. Anyway, so Gro throws the spear and it hits Lai in the chest. And Gwydion, who's up in the mountains, senses the boy's death. And he turns him into an eagle and he flies into him and he brings him back to life. And then he's so angry at Blood Awood and her deception. And Blood Awood completely is in love with this man, but she's also in love with the sun because she's made of flowers, right? So he comes to her and he says, for your deception, you will never see the sun again. And with that, he turns her into an owl, and she spends the rest of her life never being able to be in love with the man that she absolutely truly adores, and she can never see the sun. Now, as fantastical a tale as that is, how does that relate to us? The three curses that Arianrhod laid upon Lai were the 3 stages of male initiation in Celtic society: the taking of a name, the bearing of arms, and the marrying of a woman. She effectively made him a man-child for his entire life. Had the curses not been broken, he would have been a child for his entire life. He never would have been seen as a man. He never would have become the king that he was meant to become. Now, for us, and how that relates to us in our own life script, we're told and we're treated in such a way growing up, and perhaps as we become young people and we're on this stage of growth into our own initiation into adulthood, we're often mollycoddled, or we're treated in a way where we're disempowered by our parents, and our parents don't mean to do it. It's not like they're being mean or abusive, although obviously some parents they are. But for the most part, our parents are trying to do the best they can with the tools and the skills and understanding that they have. And unfortunately, the thing about generational wounds is that each parent inflicts the same wound plus their own on each generation of children. At some point, this has to be broken. The cycle must be broken, or as I like to call it, the gesh must be broken. But we're often treated in such a way that we spend our lives people-pleasing, sacrificing our own energy in order to achieve some form of love or respect, whether it's becoming workaholics and yes people, or whether it's within our own businesses, around how sometimes we don't really enforce proper boundaries, perhaps with our clients. We end up just giving. And there's nothing wrong with over-delivering. I'm one of those people, I under-promise, I over-deliver. But there's a limit to how much I'm willing to give, and there's a limit to how much of my time that I'm willing to give. But when our survival mode is being triggered by perhaps our childhood experiences around money, and around, we've all been taught that money doesn't grow on trees, all that kind of idea, like, our parents telling us they're broke and, there's never enough money, that gets ingrained within us, right? So when we're in our businesses, we might end up inadvertently working in ways that sabotage ourselves, and we keep giving, but we're not really kind of getting the nectar. We're not getting the fruits of our labor, because all we're doing is we're just burning ourselves out, because we're constantly worried that said client is going to run away from us. If we don't keep giving, we don't keep pleasing them, and we do this in our relationships, and we do this, with incidental, meetings with different people. We're always trying to find ways for other people to love and accept us, and we give so much of ourselves in doing that. That's our life script. That's the gesh that we've been placed upon, and many other geshes that just sort of crop up within our lives, within interactions in daily life. How many times are we misunderstood by people? People attach stories to us, perhaps, and we do it to other people as well. Like one day, like one of our co-workers perhaps is a bit grumpy, and we think, oh God, they don't like us. Oh, what have I done to upset them? Obviously, poor co-worker is having just a rough day, or they've just been, told off for something at work, or they're having difficulties at home, and it's absolutely nothing to do with us. Yet somehow we've decided that it's all about us, because we can never see beyond our own selves. And that's our blind spot. We are the gods and the goddesses of our own universe. We kind of think that everything that's happening around us is something to do with us, and that's not really the case. So from that, the question that I would ask you is to examine your own life story. Who are you? Who your character? Who are you within your own life story? And what are the things that you've grown up with that you take with you now? This is your gesh. Like, what were the messages that you grew up with? Were you told that you were too stupid, or were you told that you weren't enough of something, or were you told or compared to your brothers or your sisters or your cousin, or the little girl or boy who lived down the road, or your friends' children? We grew up with these messages, and one of the ways I liken this, imagine that you're 7 or 8 years old, right, and you're doing a math test at school, right? This is a really important part in our learning and our development. We're like sponges at this age, and all the messages we hear have such a powerful impact on us. So you're 7, 8 years old, and you're doing a math test at school, and maybe maths is not your strongest skill, right? It definitely wasn't mine. And you fail the math test, and the teacher berates you for it, and it's like, you should have tried harder, and you never try enough. And then you go home, and your parents are like, oh my God, your brother did the test the other day. Why can't you do it? Why are you, your head's always in the clouds, or you're always playing. You need to take life seriously. I mean, 8 years old. Should we really be taking math that seriously? I mean, my God, no. But hey, your childhood should be enjoyed. It's not meant to be a trial in and of itself, but for many of us, it was, right? This becomes a gesh in your life. It becomes a curse placed upon you. Incidentally, accidentally, these people didn't mean it. They weren't necessarily trying to be mean. Again, I make the distinction, yes, that some parents are evil and terrible people. But for the most part, our parents just wanted the best for us. They wanted us to have a better life. So they did something in a stupid, silly moment, and not realizing that 20 years from that point, you might then believe that you're a failure, and you might have a fear of failure. And perhaps you're going into work with this fear of failure, and you're constantly giving more and more and more in order for you to be seen as better, because you have this intrinsic fear. But if in that moment that teacher said to you, do you know what? It's okay. It's one math test. We'll try harder. I'll give you extra tuition. What are you struggling with? Let's look at it. Let's work together to find a solution. And if you went home and your parents said, listen, it's one test, so you're not good at maths, but you're amazing at English. Your artwork is beautiful, and I love watching you play. How supportive would that be? How much of an impact would that change your life if someone just gave you that little bit of inspiration, so that you would grow up believing that no matter what happened, that even if you didn't succeed, you didn't fail. And for me, actually, there is only ever one failure. Failure was quitting, giving up. I know that because I've done it a lot of my life. I was a real quitter, interestingly enough, which is how I've ended up with my 7th business, because this time I didn't quit. But you would grow up with such a more empowering message, a much more empowering story, and the threads within your tapestry wouldn't be tainted with this negative life script, this negative idea about yourself. It would weave so seamlessly. And when we think about our life journey, right, it's a journey. There's not a destination. We're never really going anywhere, we're just going somewhere. So you imagine a path, right? This is how I understand the threads, how all the threads come together. You imagine a path. Perhaps it's in a beautiful forest. I like that because I like walking in nature. And you're meandering down this path in the forest with the current choices you've made. And at some point, you make a new choice, that the path that you're on no longer is the one you want to walk. You don't want to walk to the river, you want to walk to the mountains, perhaps. So you decide to veer off on a new course, and off you go on your little journey. But you're constantly looking back for some reason. And every now and again, you stop and you think, am I making the right choice? And you look back down the path and you think, I don't know. And you continue. And eventually, perhaps this path no longer feels like it supports or sustains you, or is the one that fills you full of joy. And you go off on another one, and you're constantly looking back and you're thinking, oh my God, should I be on this path? I don't know. And the reason for that is that the threads within your life that make up your tapestry are still all connected, all woven together. That sometimes we have to examine the past story that we have and cut the threads. And in cutting the threads, we can then take this stitch and we can reweave it back into the tapestry of our life in a much more empowering way. But we're not literally going to cut threads. I mean, I'm not going to start pulling threads out of my top and go and cut them. The cutting of the thread really is symbolic. It's the idea that we examine and we look at the messages that we have growing up. And this is one of the things that I do with my clients. I get them to look at the current choices, whatever it might be. So perhaps they're struggling in a relationship. What's the story of your relationship? What beliefs are you bringing into it? And they'll go, well, you know, that I have to be a good partner, and doing that, I have to do this, that, or the other, and I have to sacrifice myself and I have to work really hard. And it's always about, you know, making sure that I'm doing this, that, and the other. And then the question comes down, well, is that really the truth? And is that supporting you? And how much hard work is it to have to do that all the time? God, that would, you know, that's a lot of work. We can make our relationships easier. So what we do is we find the origin of their story, and I take them back. So there are many different techniques for going back into our memories and reimagining them. You see, the interesting thing about our memory, right? We never remember how an incident ever actually occurred. What happens is that we remember the emotion that we felt. So we go back to this test, right? We remember the moment we were made to feel like a failure. And I know some people say, well, no one can ever make you feel anything. I'm really sorry, but at 8 years old, the whole world makes you feel a lot of things, and you don't have the conscious like understanding that we have today. So as a child, you are made to feel a lot of things. So at that time, like, you're made to feel like you're a failure because everyone's telling you you're a failure. You don't have the internal resources or resilience to survive that and go, the hell no. Okay. So we go back and we look at these. So memory is always the emotion. And what happens is the brain, the mind, whatever you want to call it, the visual aspect of ourselves creates a visual and auditory experience on top of it. And then, and it might not be exactly how it played out, but it's kind of how we remember it. We're in class and we're crying, and perhaps it was a sunny day, perhaps it wasn't a sunny day, but for some reason we remember it as a sunny day. The interesting thing about that is that if we change the emotional response in this story, and it's really interesting that lady on that comment said that, because I was like, yeah, it's exactly how we reimagine experience. We change the emotional impact, we change the story. But to change the emotional impact, we have to change the story. We have to unweave the old one and reweave a new one. So in this moment, perhaps you decide that you're going to reimagine it as a child. So we're connecting with the inner child level, because the inner child, from a therapeutic perspective, and also from myself as a spiritual teacher, like the spirit of our inner child holds the memory of our trauma within itself. Our inner child is our true self, truly stunted by trauma. That if we didn't have all the traumas we had, then our inner child would be who we are: playful, delightful, joyful, happy, and abundant, and just energy. But of course, that hasn't happened because we've been stunted by years of trauma, right? So we go back, we connect with our inner child, we go back to this memory, and then we reimagine it. So perhaps you pass the test, or you didn't pass the test, but you got the validation you needed, the help, the support, the inspiring message that it doesn't matter that you failed a test at 8 years old. In the greatest scheme of things, it's not going to matter. And here is the interesting thing: like, we're taught all these subjects at school, right? But then we leave school we don't do all of these things. We don't become a, a historian, geographer, mathematician, scientist, English literature specialist. We go into a particular specialism. So the things that we weren't good at, it don't matter. And to be fair, I don't think that math matters that much, unless you're going to do science or statistics or something to do with math. You use a calculator, like the rest of us. It doesn't have a greater bearing. But at that young age, at that tender age, it has such an impact. So you reimagine the experience. And then what I do with people, so every person that's a part of this story has taken a bit of your spirit. It's taken a bit of your power. And when you imagine a child, they're incredible. They have such energy and such passion and such joy. Like spending time with my nephew is amazing. When my son was younger, spending time with him was incredible. To watch their imagination, like whatever was going on inside their mind, come out and play and joy, is just phenomenal, right? So I would lost where I was going to go with that. Sorry, I've had a bit of a brain moment.
I just wanted to say it's really synchronistic that you've kind of used the analogy of you as an 8-year-old or a 7-year-old with the maths test being compared to your brother, because I'm actually a twin and I have a twin brother who is always good at maths.
Yeah.
And I wasn't. I was good at English.
Yeah.
And just like listening to you, and now I'm in business, and you have practical maths, and I have to be, not brilliant at maths, but I have to be competent in it.
Yes.
Right. And so it's just really synchronistic that you are using that analogy, Paul.
Right. And thank you. You've helped me re-jog where I was. So the spirit of this child has been stolen in this moment by these people. Their confidence, their self-esteem, their ability to be resilient. So what I do is a process that we call power retrievals. So if you ever kind of filtered around the sort of new age community, they talk about this thing called cord cutting. And unfortunately, I'm going to be mindful here that I'm not negative in a way, but sometimes when the new age community get hold of things and they sort of appropriate it, they don't bring the fullness of the technique. So perhaps you've had a bad relationship. I'm going to cut the cords. They're going to cut the cords. Yeah, great. But they don't. It's a shamanic technique, and there's a really important part that's the follow up. Is the taking back of the power that's been taken from you. So what I do in this moment, and this is where the thread begins to unweave itself. If you imagine, like when you're stitching something, like it's a knot on top of a knot on top of a knot. So different stories have begun to intersect and woven a knot, and that knot is the belief in yourself, whatever it might be, that you're not good enough, or you need to do this, whatever. So what we're doing is we're unweaving that knot, we're unweaving the story so that the threads can fall free, so they can be rewoven in new different ways, right? So what we do is we do it in this experience, and it's very much a meditative. The whole thing is a meditative, shamanic journey experience. You stand in front of the people that have taken your power. So perhaps you'll visualize an energetic cord that will connect them, and you cut it, and then you call back your spirit, you call back your power into your body, your confidence, your self-esteem, your belief, your resilience. And in that moment, again, that thread begins to unwind even further. And the next thing I do with my clients, and we're as we're doing this, we're examining like where they're feeling, like what's the belief. And by this point, people are like, I don't really feel like I'm that unconfident anymore. I've actually got this new sense of self-belief because they've called all that back to themselves. And the final bit that I do, and it's someone that I absolutely love, EFT energy, the whole tapping thing. So you can use EFT energy. The reason why I use that is because it's a much more profound technique, because you can actually use it to tap away old beliefs, old stories, and you can tap in new beliefs and new stories. So literally by tapping on all of these energy points. And what's really interesting, again, because my discipline is wider than just my spiritual teaching. I'm also a qualified therapist. I'm a therapeutic counselor. I'm also a cognitive behavioral therapist. I've trained in NLP. I've done all these different things. The one thing I've understood through all these different disciplines, and this is something that's happened within science and the medical community, they've tried to understand the concept between the Chinese meridians, or these sort of the nadi from the sort of Hindu traditions, and modern day kind of the physiology and anatomy, like where does this fit in as a physical representation? And eventually what they figured out was the fact that the meridians, these systems, connected to the central nervous system, our entire nervous system. What else have we learned? Trauma is stored in the central nervous system. We think about like the vagal nerve in the back of the throat. I also trained in polyvagal nerve therapy as well. So the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system control the fight, flight, or freeze response, because obviously this stuff is stored within our trauma. The trauma is stored within the central nervous system. If the meridians are the access point to our central nervous system on an energetic level, then by tapping, what we're doing is we're almost like how a valve would work. If you think about a pipe that has pressure in it, eventually that pipe will build so much pressure it will burst, and this is a way, a valve to release it. The tapping on the energy points on these various acupressure points around the body relieves that pressure. You're releasing the stored energy of trauma, of PTSD in the central nervous system by using the meridian points. So we can take out old beliefs and instill new beliefs. We can unweave the old story and weave in the new one. And by the time I get people to the end of this, they're like, I understand why I believe this, but at the same time, I don't understand where this story came from. But now, because they can feel this new story, they feel this greater sense of confidence. They've unwound the old story, they've unweaved it, and they've woven in this new story. And we can use these techniques, and there were so many of them out there to examine. Like mine is just one, and the combining of this story, the way that I work energetically in the background. And this is the bit that's really important. If you imagine energetic threads that are connecting us to each of our past choices that we've made, those choices will still forever dog our lives unless the energetic threads are cut. They're doing their bit in the background. I'm energetically working to cut themselves free of these old stories so they can reweave everything together in a nice new way, so that the past doesn't become, it's not like it becomes a distant memory, but the past story no longer has that emotional impact. They're not almost re-traumatized. And I'm going to hit this home with one final kind of idea, that if you think about it, if you imagine a time when you were happy, you were dancing through a field and it's a spring day and you can almost feel the sunshine, you feel the sense of joy. The same thing can happen if you imagine an argument you had with your spouse last week and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I'm really angry. Even though that happened 2 weeks ago, you've resolved it, you might still have an emotional trigger because that story is still running and it's a concurrent story and it's all these threads that are woven together. And that story reminds you of an argument from before, and then going all the way back reminds you of perhaps how your parents treated you and shouted at you as a child or whatever it might be. But by cutting ourselves free, we relieve ourselves of the burden of this old story, and then we're free to create new stories. So if you were given back your confidence and you had confidence in yourself and you realize that failure is just a concept, and only real failure, like I said, is the one that we quit, but not succeeding is not the same as failure, because in everything that we do, we learn something. So we were more conscious and aware of the threads within our lives, within our tapestry. What new story would you reweave? What would you weave next? You had all of those tools to be able to do that. You would create something more conscious. You would make more decisions. But of course, that's just one story. We're 100 million different stories. We're hundreds of threads, thousands, millions of threads, and we're all interacting with each other's threads. So eventually, at some point, we might have to go back and do this again and again and again and again and again until we've cleared out all the old story and we've written a completely new story. That is the process that to reweave.
Reweaved a new story. That is
Absolutely.
just so powerful. And as you were like telling that Celtic story, I just kept thinking how there were some points of it that were they were different, but they were also very similar to the Moses and Pharaoh story.
Yes.
The Pharaoh in this particular, in your story is a female,
Yeah.
but with the child lie kind of being taken in a basket. I was like, my God, there was just like some really universal themes there.
Mm,
And
yeah.
also in the story of Moses and Pharaoh, there are these magicians,
Mm,
Pharaoh's magicians, and Moses with his staff, but as also when you were talking, it just kind of like made me really think about when you were talking about shedding skin, like a snake
yeah.
sheds skin, right? And I
Yes.
know in a lot of certain monotheistic traditions, Abrahamic traditions, the snake is always associated with evil, but not
Mm,
necessarily, because the snake is also a creature of God. God made that snake,
yeah.
right? And
And
we
you know
all,
what's really interesting
yeah,
about that? In the Celtic tradition, snakes are symbols of wisdom. So the
yeah,
snake
yeah,
as a pagan, like as a druid, so that's my religion is a druid, not just a shaman. As a druid, the highest symbol, the highest icon of a druid is the snake. It's given only to the highest ranking
but
druids because they represent wisdom.
then if you actually really dive deep into the biblical and the Quranic story, Moses' staff,
Yeah.
right, turned into a snake,
Yes.
serpent, and ate all the, like the magicians,
Yeah.
like magic. So
Yeah.
even there's a symbolism there. Moses' staff turned into a serpent.
Yeah.
Moses in Jewish tradition is the wise, the greatest prophet.
Yeah.
In Sufi tradition, Moses is on the same level as intellect,
Hmm.
wisdom.
Yeah. And
So
isn't
can
it
you
also
see
that?
how our stories are very, very similar? They're
Yes.
different. They're
Yeah.
very different, but they're also very, that thread is very, is like weaved throughout the different traditions,
Yes.
pagan and monotheistic.
Yes, definitely. And the thing is about a lot of these stories as well is all of these things, these symbols that they speak, they're archetypes, aren't they? They reach into the archetypal aspect of ourselves. You know, the snake. Perhaps it's, people talk about, oh, there's a snake in the grass, and they're talking about perhaps someone being, a bit sly, a bit, unfair or mean. In other traditions, the snake is seen as a symbol of transformation because it sheds its skin and grows. In other traditions, it's seen as a symbol of wisdom. In the Brahmic tradition, within Hinduism, and within the Kundalini experience, you have two twin snakes that wrap themselves around the spine, known as Ida and Pingala, that represents as they grow. It's the spiritual enlightenment experience, the Kundalini fire, the serpent making its way up to the crown. But these are universal themes. Like anyone can understand the concept of a staff, whether it's Moses' staff, whether it's the shepherd's crook, whether it's Gandalf's staff or Merlin's staff. These are symbols of archetypal power. I remember reading many years ago, contemporary Kabbalah teacher, I can't remember his name now, but he related the story of Moses as the Pharaoh being the ego, and Moses being the sort of the aspect of the higher consciousness or the soul, the spirit, the spark of God.
Yeah.
And the story is about the challenge of overcoming the ego. And I sat and I was like, I just interesting concept. I quite like that.
It's something that I teach, and
Mm.
a lot of spiritual teachers teach it, because basically we all have an inner Pharaoh. We all
Yes.
have an inner Moses. We
Mm.
all have an inner Jesus. We all have an inner lie
Mm.
from your story,
Yeah, yeah,
right? We
yeah.
all have that that magician that was in your story. We
Mm.
all have that inner math.
Yeah.
Who you were talking about. The and these stories are constantly being retold in our lives. But when
Mm.
we become conscious of these,
Yeah.
like you called archetypes, energy patterns, we then see the story within us and
Mm.
around us.
Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
what you teach and what I teach is very similar, although the stories are just so, that's why I love doing what I do, because just kind of tapping into the richness of the diversity is what keeps our humanity being not so boring. Can you imagine if we were all like, all talking about Moses and Pharaoh? We'd be like bored. But
Yes, absolutely.
we'd be bored because it's like, oh my god, it's Moses and Pharaoh again. I
Yeah,
really, I'm tired of that story. Like for instance, we get bored of I don't know, watching The Crown.
yeah,
We
yeah.
want we
Well,
want
we'd be like binge watching all of our mythologies, wouldn't it? It would be the same story. We'd get bored of that. No, I totally get that. I think, excuse me, I talk too much. I think one of the things I love about different culture, and like I said, I've studied all these different traditions from around the world, and obviously the central aspect of what I do is my own Celtic root, because the stories come alive. Like when I think about King Arthur and Merlin, like there's a powerful richness within those stories. But I love learning about other cultures. That
and
they're
I
all,
think that's
it's
where,
rich with us.
yeah,
It
and I
just
think
exists.
that's where I kind of have that connection to you, because I, growing up in London, I loved King Arthur and the Round
Mm,
Table and
yeah,
Merlin and the Lady of the Lake, and
yeah.
and I think that's like my connection with you. It's a very deep connection.
Absolutely. Interestingly, about the Lady of the Lake. So, in all of obviously, there are various different versions of the Arthurian story. Predominantly, you've got the Welsh version, and you've got the Cornish version. The Lady of the Lake actually only ever existed in the Cornish tradition. It doesn't exist in any of the other stories. There's some Middle English ones as well, when the stories kind of traveled up and it kind of became Christianized, because it wasn't in its origin, it wasn't a Christian story. The Lady of the Lake actually isn't far from here. It's a little place called Doesmary Port. Um, and in the Cornish tradition, Lancelot is actually the son of the Lady of the Lake. And it's a little place called Doesmary Port, not far from here in Cornwall. But it's interesting how that one thing has got so woven into the Arthurian story that it's now indistinguishable. Like everyone knows that the Lady of the Lake is where he Excalibur gets thrown into. But in the Welsh tradition and in the Middle English tradition, it doesn't exist. But it just somehow got pulled into it. I love the Arthurian myth. I've spent some 30 odd years, probably more, reading and studying it. I've watched every King Arthur movie you can imagine. Excalibur used to be my favorite, and then I saw the one with Clive Owen, which was okay. They paint him as a Roman soldier. All right, it's not quite who he is, but I like the idea, and I like how modern historians are trying to create some physical representation of him. But really, the story of Arthur, right? It's an archetype. Whether or not Arthur was ever a real guy and whether or not Merlin was ever a real guy, it's an archetypal story that reaches into the depth of us. The idea of again, it's that hero story. He's just a regular dude. He's just a farm boy. He's a pauper. He's nobody. Yet somehow he magically pulls the sword from the stone, which becomes his call to action. And of course, then meets Merlin, which becomes his guide. And the trials and tribulations that he goes through as he comes from boyhood to manhood to become the king, to this idea of an almost utopian type society where his knights, they all sit on a round table. He doesn't sit on a throne distancing himself. He sits with his men and able to look them in the eye. Obviously part of the story is that eventually one of his friends betrays him, and then tries to steal his wife. But that's more about the inner betrayal that we do to ourselves, how we betray ourselves in many different ways. But the story still reaches a part of us, this idea of hope, that one day we can all work as a collaboration together. And of course, the fact that he's got 12 knights is not lost. Again, the number 12, it's in so many
That
different
is
spiritual
just,
traditions.
because as you were talking about Arthur and the Round Table, all I kept thinking about was Medina. And that's what I kept thinking about, the constitution of Medina and what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, founded, which was a you know, I don't want to call it a state. It was a society which had pagans,
Hmm.
polytheists,
Yeah,
monotheists,
yeah,
Jewish,
yeah,
Christian, Muslim,
yeah.
living together.
Wow, that's really cool.
And he wasn't, I know lots of Muslims will probably stone me for this, but he wasn't like the head. It was very much a collaboration and a
Mm,
round table
yeah,
where he, you know, interesting enough, the companions are not called his disciples. We call the companions his companions.
yeah,
So there's like a peer equality.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. And again, and the 12 nights, the number 12, like it's a spiritual number. You have 12 constellations, the astrology, the number 12. Again, it's like when you peer into mythology and you strip away the top layer and you look deeper and deeper into it, there's more to it. There's such a richness that comes from understanding mythology, like the depth of story and how we can pull that into our daily lives. Like how does the Arthurian myth, like how does that impact and empower us today? Well, the idea is that if we just cut the bullshit, we shed the bullshit, and we just work together as a collaboration, stripping away the ego, uh, and saw each other as equal people, that we could work together as a collaboration, connected, working towards a
And
unified aim.
just that concept of the round table is
Mm,
like everybody has a place
yeah,
on the table.
absolutely.
It's like that circle of round, the circle of life, I
Yeah, it is the
suppose, in
circle
a
of life.
way.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, it's also that each person is equal distance from each other. They can all look each other in the eye. There's an equality that comes from sitting together in a circle. The concept of a sacred circle, which is the name of my business, weirdly enough, actually is ancient. The idea of people sat around campfires in ancient times, telling and sharing stories, sharing religious activities, whatever it might be, whether it's drumming, whether it's dancing, whether it's the telling of stories or chanting, sacred ceremonies. Life moves in a circle. We go through the seasons. It's a circle. The sun, the earth, everything revolves around each other. Everything's moving in a cyclic way. So again, there's a deeper kind of story that actually this group of individuals, they're bound together in a sacred oath of brotherhood, of working
Mhm,
together. Again, you
mhm,
kind of come deeper and you come deeper and deeper and deeper into it. That what's necessarily on the surface level isn't really the deeper truth of the story, because you delve deeper and you delve deeper and you kind of get into that archetypal realm. We talk about things like, I'd use it a lot in my teachings, like the warrior, the king, the magician, the lover. And in a way, all of these central things are within that story. Obviously, the king is King Arthur, the warriors are his knights, the lover is Guinevere, and obviously the magician is Merlin. And how each one of those elements, they represent a part of the psyche, you know.
mhm,
And if you think about the warrior and the fact that there's 12 of them, in a way, that's you could see that each one of them be like being the code of conduct, like the knights of chivalry. Obviously, we don't need to. Chivalry often is rooted in misogyny, but the concept of having a warrior's code, a distinct number of ideas and ideals in which we live by, is really important. And I'm going to relate that back to John with the doctor, right? So the thing about us is that when this is, and you see people do it. Hello, I'm Paul. I'm a gay shaman, self-employed, right? You still don't know who I am. I've just reeled off a bunch of labels, right? But if I was to tell you, hey, I'm Paul, I'm kindness, I'm generosity, I'm compassion, I'm creative, I'm insightful, I'm wise, you already understood me on a deeper level, because you can understand what kindness is, like, because you can feel that within yourself. So if we were to take away all the things that we call labels, which are just stories that we've attached to ourselves, and we brought it down to a core set of qualities or ideals that become our own warrior code, and it's something I do with my clients, creating your own warrior code, your own set of ideals. These become an intrinsic part of who you are, and they become your core identity. They don't shift, they don't change. Doesn't matter what happens in your life, that doesn't change. But you one day might not be a social worker. One day you might be a retired social worker, or you might one day decide you want to be an entrepreneur, or you might, a person might decide that they no longer want to be a married man or woman. Well, then who are they when they shift that? If they take the story away from the label and they bring it into the core of their being, to the core qualities of who they are, there's a deeper, more powerful story of who they are, and it doesn't change. It just grows. You become more kind. You become more generous. You become more creative. And another thing as well, like I've got a friend who's he's a musician, he's a painter, he sculpts, he does all this thing, and he's like, I get really exhausted when I go, yeah, I'm a musician, I'm a painter. I said, why do that? Why not just tell people you're creative or artistic? And he's like, if you're going to use logic, I'm like, there you go. Stop creating a story to the things that you love that become a label that identify you. Just be creative and live that. Make
Exactly.
that.
Exactly. And I just find, like, when you were talking about the Lady of the Lake, like as you were kind of talking about the different, like you've got like your spiritual guides, spirit guides, and your animal guides.
Yeah.
I just kept thinking, this is something that my spiritual teacher taught me when I first met her back in 1992. And over the years, in the first, I think, I can't remember when it was, I think definitely it was in the 90s, she taught me the story about, everybody's very familiar with the story of Noah and the different animals, right? In the ark. And we have those different animals within us.
Yes.
And how we actually, train them, how we actually look after them. Like, we can see them as different animals within us, or we can see them as our animal guides or our spirit, like our spirit guides. So that snake within us is not necessarily that, it's not necessarily the evil snake, or the, like the donkey is not necessarily the lazy donkey. Right.
Yes.
And so how you kind of make that like the donkey into the horse, into the barak, the animal creature that goes straight to God on the night journey. The night journey is happening next week. Goes straight to the divine, right? And so each is it was really interesting when you're talking about like the 3 stages. It was just like, I kind of kept reflecting and kind of like, like it was just that you're like one side and I'm the other, but there's so much like mirroring. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. And it's interesting, like when we talk about power animals, we talk about our animals, spirit totems. Like, obviously, like from my tradition, when we're born, we're connected to a tree spirit, right? So mine's the oak. Makes sense because the oak is the wisest. The word for oak in Irish is dua, which is the root of the word druid, which is what I am, right? I'm a priest of my religion. So we're connected to a tree, right? A tree spirit that becomes a guardian, a guide. It becomes our guardian between the worlds and the realms. We're also assigned a power animal, right? So I do this. I teach what we call a power animal retrieval through my shamanic training with people. And what we do is we go into a journey. We meet our power animal, and I tell you, 9 times out of 10, people they want a bear, or they want a wolf, or they want a hawk or an eagle. Something they associate with power. And there's a very interesting thing why people want one of these. It's not about being ferocious, but it's about being like the most powerful of these animals, because bear is all about wisdom. Wolf is all about the psychic development, the intuition, the moon. The eagle is the ability to see far and wide. It's because people feel so disempowered that they feel that they conjure up, or they have some kind of powerful animal guide, that it means that they're powerful, right? And what happens is they get down there and they meet a shrew or a spider, or my friend who absolutely hates seagulls. Her power animal was a seagull, and it's brilliant because it's all about the greater learning. So when I did mine, right, I wanted a bear. Not gonna lie, I wanted a big black bear because I love them and they're awesome. I get down there and there's this tiny baby deer, and I'm thinking, right, well, that's really bloody disappointing, you know. But what I learned from this is that the deer represents the innocence, it represents the joy, it represents the heart, it's intuition, it's healing, it's the inner child. And years later, incorporating inner child work into my work made so much sense, that the power animal had the deeper meaning for me. It was all about the lesson that I was learning in this life, about becoming the healer, about becoming wise, about being innocent and playful. And that deer has remained a constant companion for the last 20 years. And he has the incredible ability that he'll shapeshift as well. So he'll show himself sometimes as an innocent, you know, childlike deer, you know, but sometimes he transforms into this incredible stag with the most enormous antlers, like, and he's almost giant-like. And in some of these shamanic journeys, I've ridden him, and it's just, we have a phenomenal relationship. And over the years, I've developed connections with other power animals, which make up the bedrock of my teaching. So I have the raven, which is all about seeing beyond the realms, it's about seeing beyond the illusion of life. It's about prophecy, the raven's ability to see in the dark, to illuminate the illusion, to illuminate the shadow. Another one is fox, which is all about cunning and dream work, about, again, diving into the world around us, but also being ever aware and present. And the final one, which is a salmon, which is all about wisdom, weirdly enough, because in the old tradition, there was a salmon known as Io, and it's the wisest salmon. It's the oldest creature in the Celtic mythology, and there's a bit of an argument about whether or not this creature actually comes from the Northern Norse tradition of Scandinavia, whether it's actually Irish. But he eats 5 hazelnuts from this well, that he ends up eating all of the wisdom of the universe, effectively. And as a king, he decides that he spends his entire life trying to catch this salmon. Everyone's trying to catch this salmon, because you eat the salmon, you gain all the wisdom of the universe. So Cole, he finally catches the salmon, he catches Io, and he gets his manservant to cook the fish, but he says, do not eat the fish, because if you do, you're gonna end up with all the wisdom, and I want it. So anyway, so the poor servant, he's cooking the fish, and then he goes to test whether the fish is cooked properly, and some of the fat spits on his finger, and he burns his finger, and instinctively he goes, and in doing so, he absorbs all of the wisdom of the salmon. And obviously the king is livid. There's a lot of angry people in Celtic mythology, always being screwed over. The king is livid, but of course he uses his manservant to his own advantage. So basically, the only way that this manservant can gain wisdom is what he does. His king asks him, Colin asks him a question. What he does, he bites his finger, and in doing so, he releases the wisdom of the salmon. I love all this kind of the strange mythology and how that relates to us today. Like, we're all searching for some greater meaning, right? We're all searching for greater wisdom, for greater understanding, and it often eludes us.
That story is very the beginning of it is very similar to on Fridays Muslims read the Song of the Cave. And in that Song of the Cave, there is the story where Moses, interestingly, kind of keep coming back to Moses today. Moses goes in search of knowledge, and he comes to the junction of the 2 seas, where he sees the fish, right? And then he loses the fish. And then at that point, when he loses the fish, he then meets the famous character Khidr, the green one, full of wisdom, who then teaches him wisdom with he goes on a journey, and I'm not going to go into the whole story, but as you were talking, I was like, oh my God, now I can see the fish. Really, that story came to life.
Yeah,
via that Celtic story.
Yeah, exactly, isn't it? And this is what I mean. Like, stories reach into the realm; they go beyond like words. Like words are powerful. I mean, there are reasons why, and there's an old axiom, and it's attributed to a guy that not everyone likes, but it's a guy, a 20th century occultist known as Aleister Crowley, and he said, we spell words and we use words and spells because magic and language is so interconnected. Words reach into the archetypal realms. They take us on this journey into these realms where simple things, fish, staffs, cups, they become more than just fish, staff, and cups. They become the medium by which we convey wisdom. So, and if we were to go into other cultures, there's probably a fish and a staff and a cup and a rock and a sword and a wise man in a cave. These are archetypal story methods that reach into our consciousness and implant or imbue, ingrain ideas. And you've probably got like the biggest book of mythological tales that had all of the myths, it would probably be a giant great big book, but there would be so many similar themes and ideas, because again, a fish is, okay, it's a fish, but in many cultures it represents endeavors or endurance. It represents wisdom, for example. The cup is probably one of the most primal archetypal images, because it's the grail. What does the grail represent? Well, it represents the bloodline of Jesus for some people. It represents the womb of the goddess for other people. It represents the power of God to others. The grail quest, which in reality is again, it's the quest for wisdom, isn't it? It's the quest for, it's the Knight's Tale isn't really about trying to find a cup. It's trying to find the land of milk and honey. The greater journey, it's the hero's journey. Again, all of these things, they just come together when you understand the power of mythology, you understand the power of story and how that relates to our lives. You have the power to rewrite your own story, which is, again, was the whole basis of this, is to unweave the old story and reweave the new one. Become the Superman of your own story, without being blasphemous. Become the Moses or the Merlin or the Arthur, whoever it might be, of your own story.
Exactly. And I think we need to, that is not really blasphemous, because we need to be the writers and the weavers of our own story, because we have been given this life to live our story.
Absolutely.
I need to live my story, not my parents' story. You need to live your story. And as you are watching, I know lots of people are watching, you need to live your story. Your story is not going to be the same as your partner's story or your child's story or your neighbor's story. We are all living our lives and walking our paths. That's what our lives are. Thank you so much, Paul. I have learned so much today. Really, I mean, I knew a little bit about Celtic traditions and myths, but really, it's just been fascinating. Really, really fascinating. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Paul. My unlikely friend, but a very, very good friend.
Absolutely.
And thank you for watching this masterclass, and hopefully see you soon.
Take care. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. I don't know how to leave.